quick word from this week's sponsor, Ground News. War often brings out the most heated and polarising perspectives, and the news we read and the news we miss heavily influences our outlook on those types of issues. This is why I'm happy to be partnering with Ground News again for this video. They're an app and website that gather related news articles from around the world and political spectrum in one place. For example, let's take a look at this story on a recent airstrike conducted by Israel in Beirut. I can instantly access all 340 articles Ground News has found reporting on it, and see most of this coverage is coming from centre-rated and from highly factual sources. Comparing coverage is interesting. The bias comparison shows that left-leaning sources, including this article by PBS News, tend to emphasise international calls for de-escalation and restraint. This is a completely different perspective than the right-leaning sources, such as The Telegraph, tending to emphasise the justification for prosecuting this target. It's interesting to read the news in this way, where the origin of a source can heavily dictate the narrative, especially when social media feeds often tailor what we see to our political viewpoints, reducing diversity of perspective. Check it out at ground.news/operations room to make sure you're getting all sides of every story. They're giving my viewers 40% off their Vantage subscription, the same plan I use for unlimited access. I think Ground News is doing important work, and I hope you'll check them out. On the 5th of April 2003, Colonel David Perkins' 2nd Brigade Combat Team launched an armoured raid deep into the Iraqi capital of Baghdad. The raid, nicknamed the Thunder Run, was the first of 2 attacks which drove behind the enemy lines and eventually unhinged the Iraqi defence of their capital. But what exactly is a Thunder Run, and how effective is this tactic? In this video, we will discuss the history of Thunder Run tactics in modern warfare, examples where it has worked well, and examples where it failed miserably. Cutting through the semantics of what constitutes a Thunder Run is key to understanding what this tactic means and how it works in combat. There is some disagreement on where the name Thunder Run in military terminology originated. Historian Williamson Murray wrote in his book The Iraq War that prior to the invasion, Thunder Run was the nickname for the group forays that young soldiers launched into Korean and German bar districts on payday. However, David Zucchino and Mark Bowden have a different explanation in their book, Thunder Run, the Armoured Strike to Capture Baghdad. According to them, the term originated in the Vietnam War to describe resupply missions to forward artillery bases, codenamed Thunder 1, 2, and so on. The authors explain, the Viet Cong, attempting to disrupt US supply convoys, sent out guerrilla teams at night to cut the roads and set up ambushes. To keep the arteries secure, American commanders dispatched columns of tanks and armoured vehicles up and down the roads at dusk. The columns moved at high speeds, blasting away on both sides of the highway to draw enemy fire, what the military calls recon by fire. In fact, the 1993 botched raid into Mogadishu, which resulted in the Black Hawk Down fiasco, has also been referenced as a Thunder Run example. However, other nations have used different terminology for armoured thrusts, as well as using the term Thunder Run to describe similar but militarily different actions. As one example, the 2022 Ukrainian counter-offensive in the Kharkiv region made extensive use of surprise attacks behind Russian lines using armoured vehicles. These attacks have been described by journalists and military figures as both Thunder Runs and other tactics such as light strike or reconnaissance in force. Furthermore, many of these attacks by Ukrainian forces did not involve large numbers of heavily armoured vehicles such as tanks. Semantically speaking, these terms describe different things, but have been lumped together as a catch-all for rapid surprise attacks designed to cause chaos behind enemy lines. Alternatively, reconnaissance in force has been defined by the United States Army Command and General Staff College as a means for gathering information and influencing the enemy's capability to fight. The other interchangeable term for Thunder Run, light strike, has been defined by military reporter Tom Sables as punching in behind enemy lines with smaller, faster, wheeled and often civilian vehicles, setting ambushes, reporting enemy movement, and using said vehicles as ambulances. Simply put, Thunder Run has come to mean many different things by many different militaries, but is mostly used to describe deep ground assaults into enemy territory, where the attacking force uses speed and firepower to force the defenders to flee or surrender. In Iraq, Thunder Runs were utilised as a means to avoid costly urban combat, where the enemy would be overwhelmed by superior firepower before they could set up an effective defence. The Baghdad Thunder Runs in 2003 were well defined by the commanders who carried out the attacks. The overall commander of the invasion, General Tommy Franks, wrote in his book American Soldier, "This mission would be more than a show of force. In fact, my intent was to probe the enemy defences to see if any cohesive Republican Guard units had escaped into the city after the pounding they'd taken south of Baghdad." Colonel David Perkins commanded the 2nd Brigade Combat Team of the US 3rd Infantry Division and directly planned the Baghdad Thunder Run. When issuing his orders, Perkins told his subordinates, "The task is to enter Baghdad for the purpose of displaying combat power, to destroy enemy forces, and to simply show them that we can." The two attacks had different goals. The first Thunder Run on the 5th of April was intended to probe Iraqi defences inside the capital, and the armoured column was to rendezvous with American forces at the Baghdad International Airport. The second assault was deceptively described by Perkins to his superiors as a reconnaissance in force, but was actually an attempt to break Iraqi resistance for good. The Baghdad Thunder Runs were successful. The first arrived at the airport mostly unscathed, while the second secured an American foothold in the centre of the capital. These attacks worked thanks to coalition air supremacy, superior American technology, and effective leadership. Control of the skies was critical. American helicopters and ground attack aircraft suppressed Iraqi defences during the attack, which lessened the volume of fire directed at the armoured columns. Furthermore, coalition aircraft scouted the main route ahead of the column and marked enemy defences for later destruction in an outstanding example of combined arms warfare. The excellent quality of American armour gave ample protection and firepower to the soldiers running the gauntlet. However, decisively in this case, most Iraqi anti-tank weapons were incapable of penetrating the thick armour on Abrams tanks or Bradley fighting vehicles, while the American soldiers within these vehicles could fire back with impunity using stronger weapons. Leadership on the ground kept the column moving and maintained discipline throughout the Thunder Run. There were multiple occasions when the armoured columns were forced to stop, whether to evacuate casualties or salvage equipment, which is when the American force was at its most vulnerable. Despite the precarious situation, Colonel Perkins and his subordinates urged their men on and were decisive in issuing orders. Critical was the lack of quality and the old age of Iraqi infantry anti-tank weapons. Compare these actions in Iraq to the Russian attempted Thunder Runs during the Battle of Kiev in 2022, where the defending infantry had highly capable anti-tank weapons such as the N-Law and the Javelin, and the outcome is much different for the attacking forces. If we expand the definition of a Thunder Run to Ukraine's counter-offensive actions in 2023, we can see how this effectiveness translates to other campaigns. As mentioned earlier, the attacks by Ukraine in Kharkiv did not involve large numbers of tanks, but proved to be highly effective nonetheless. This is in part because the Ukrainians relied more on speed rather than firepower, surprising and overrunning disorganized Russian units, which mostly panicked once attacked. According to Carson Tusha's article, Ukraine's Thunder Runs, deception was an added bonus of these surprise assaults, which created an illusion of overwhelming force that unleashed a debilitating psychological impact on those who encountered the Ukrainians. As such, this allowed the more mobile but less heavily equipped Ukrainian armed forces to confuse and rout Russian units, who believed they were under attack by a much larger enemy. Tusha also notes that this is similar to the British Army's Long Range Desert Group, or LRDG, which caused chaos behind German lines during the North Africa campaign. Referencing the LRDG, he writes, "Most would have felt right at home with modern Ukrainian soldiers, firing RPGs from the back of haphazardly armoured 4x4s, lurching forward in great bounds towards the Russian frontier." The American attacks into Baghdad and Ukraine's stunning counter-offensive demonstrates perhaps the most important aspect of Thunder Runs, the immense psychological shock which can paralyse an unsuspecting defending force. However, there are drawbacks to Thunder Runs which can be seen in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Overextension can endanger a successful Thunder Run which can lead to disaster. Resupply became a major issue following the second attack, which resulted in American forces entrenched deep inside Baghdad. Having carved a path through Iraqi defences, US Army forces then had to fight intense battles to defend the fragile supply route into the capital. Although American forces held on to their positions, these costly battles demonstrated the danger of advancing too deep into enemy territory on such a narrow front. Launching a Thunder Run is also assuming the risk that the forces involved might be cut off by enemy counterattacks if not properly supported. Perhaps the best example of a failed Thunder Run was the Russian assault in Grozny during the First Chechen War on New Year's Eve 1994. The Russian army sought to quickly subdue the Chechen defences following a bloody 2-week campaign to reach the separatist capital. Their plan was to send 4 armoured columns from an amalgamation of different units into the city, supported by combat aviation, after a long and brutal preemptive bombardment. The Russian Defence Minister, General Pavel Grachev, was so confident in success that he boasted he could seize the city with just 1 airborne regiment if he wanted. In many ways, this assault was quite similar to the plan for the American Thunder Runs into Baghdad. The attacking force would strike into the heart of the enemy capital and cause the psychological collapse of the defenders. However, there were several elements working against the Russians which would prove decisive. First, the poor winter weather removes a vital aspect of successful Thunder Run, as Russian aviation could not use precision weaponry to attack Chechen positions. Attack helicopters and combat air support were mostly unavailable, and thus unable to suppress enemy defences during the assault. Second, the Russian ground forces were incompetently led, poorly trained, and suffered from low morale. The main striking force for the attack was the 131st Mykop Motor Rifle Brigade, which was composed almost entirely of untrained conscripts. Drunkenness was an epidemic that infected lower-level commanders and NCOs, as most men opposed the war on principle. To make matters worse, orders from high command were vague and confusing, which led to some units advancing in the wrong direction during the assault. This combination of factors was a recipe for disaster. The situation was also far different for the defenders, especially compared to the 2003 Baghdad Thunder Runs. The Chechen soldiers defending Grozny were highly motivated, knew the assault was coming, and many had been trained in the Soviet army. Whereas most Iraqi forces had been demoralized after weeks of fruitless fighting against the coalition, the Chechens fought with high morale, knowing they had hurt the Russian forces at the beginning of the war. Another key difference was the command structure. The Chechens fought as independent groups rather than as an organized force. This played into the defenders' hands, as they launched attacks from all directions in the middle of the urban environment. Contrast this with the Iraqi defense of Baghdad, which was completely controlled by Saddam Hussein himself. With communication nearly impossible, Saddam was unable to coordinate his forces. Chechens could also fight the Russians on relatively equal terms, considering that both sides were using standard Soviet equipment. The end result was one of the worst military defeats in modern Russian history. The Russian columns advanced into Grozny and quickly became bogged down in urban combat. The attackers found that their tanks could not elevate their turrets high enough to engage Chechen fighters firing down from tall buildings, and massive traffic jams developed on the main roads leading into the city. These confused battles soon turned into bloodbaths for the attackers, as most Russian tanks ran out of fuel and had to be abandoned. As a result, the infantry suffered an 80% casualty rate, and many Russian conscripts wandered around the city aimlessly until they were taken prisoner. The 131st Mykop Brigade was completely destroyed, losing 864 men killed or captured out of the 1,000 men, including almost all of the officers. Additionally, 20 of the 26 tanks and 102 of the 120 other armoured vehicles were destroyed or captured. The failed assault on Grozny is a perfect example of how a Thunder Run can go completely wrong. In conclusion, Thunder Run tactics can encompass many different military actions or definitions. There is no doubt these attacks can be immensely successful, like they were in Ukraine or Iraq. We can also see how a poorly supported Thunder Run, like the ones conducted by the Americans in Mogadishu in 1993 or the Russians in 1994, can lead to disaster. Regardless, the 2003 Thunder Runs in Baghdad provided the climax for the coalition invasion of Iraq and demonstrated the usefulness of such aggressive tactics in modern warfare. Thanks to our amazing patrons whose generous support enables us to make these videos. Thank you to all our new Patreons this month, and a special thanks to our Patron of the Week, Richard Woodard. Each week we choose our favourite Patreon comments to shout out. This week, Darth Rust says, "It seems that Thunder Runs work great in situations that are vulnerable to Thunder Runs. That's not always known ahead of time." If you'd like to support us, please join our Patreon at patreon.com/The Operations Room and get access to exclusive benefits such as early access to videos ad and sponsor free. We would love to have you as part of our community and really appreciate your support.